Thanks to Shaper 3D for sponsoring this video. So a lot of you guys have been asking for this, and when I say a lot, I mean like 3 people. But hey, it is finally time that we are building a media console. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, or if you're new here, well, in one of my previous videos, I went over my design process. I showed everyone how to model a piece of furniture from start to finish, and how I plan out my builds, all using my favorite 3D modeling program, Shaper 3D, who also happen to be the sponsor of today's video, but more on them later. As you can see, I've got my pile of materials here and a set of plans with cutting diagrams and step-by-step instructions on how to get this guy built. Let's move the lumber out of the way and worry about these later. So I made some changes to the original design from what was in the previous video just to make it more feasible for this build. If you guys want to get these plans, it's going to be available on my website, bedvillagecreations.com/plans, and I'm going to have it in both metric and imperial. I'll also include a 3D model as well in case you guys need to make any changes to it. And we're going to start by breaking down this sheet of plywood into 3 pieces. One is going to be for our top and bottom panels, another one for our 2 side panels, and this third piece we're going to set aside for our partitions and shelves. And before we make this split here, we're going to cut 45-degree miters on the ends of these boards. That way when we do make this split, we'll know that these 2 are going to be exactly the same and these 2 are going to be exactly the same. Since we're working with some fairly large pieces, we're going to make all those cuts using a track saw right here at the workbench. While the top and bottom panels are still a single piece, we're going to use our router and this track to cut our dados. And if you don't have a track, don't worry about it. Just use any straight edge and it's going to do the exact same thing. Now yeah, once our dados are cut, we're going to use our table saw to rip these panels to their final dimensions, and everything should match up exactly. Here are our last 2 pieces. Okay, now to glue all of this up, we are gonna use our domino for this, which is gonna help to add more strength along our miter joints. But the reason why I like to use this is actually because it helps to keep the wood aligned and prevent things from slipping around during the glue up. This thing just makes the whole process so much easier. Now, if you don't have one of these, don't worry about it. Just use the tape method, which works great. It's just that I don't have any space in the shop for something this long. right, so while we wait for the glue to cure, I figured it's a good time to start making our trim from this piece of walnut I got from Rockler. And since this guy came surface on all 4 sides already, we can skip the milling and go straight to cutting. So for now, we're gonna cut these about 20 millimeters or so longer than what they need to be, because we're gonna come back and reference the actual case dimensions later to get these guys cut to their final length. But we did rip all these pieces to their final width. And once everything has been cut, we're gonna swap over to a dado set to cut a 6mm tall by 25mm deep rabbet in all of these pieces. So that what we're gonna end up with is this lip all around the front of the case once they are all glued up. And this is what we're left with. Okay, so before we can glue this on here, we need to cut a groove along the top and bottom rails for our sliding doors. And this was actually a little bit difficult for me to figure out because of this lip that we just cut in here. So let me try to explain. In the past, what I would do is, and this is a different cabinet by the way, but let's hide the side panel. So for this particular build, I would cut grooves along the bottom and top panels, and the doors will have these tongues that sit inside those grooves that allows the doors to slide back and forth. Now, to get these doors into the cabinet, obviously we can't just move it straight in. The doors actually has to come in at an angle, like this. And then we'll insert the tongue into the top groove first, and then we'll rotate the bottom and finally drop it into the bottom groove like that. So to make this whole thing work, the top groove needs to be much deeper than the bottom one. And usually I make the bottom groove about 3mm deep, which isn't a big deal, but the top one needs to be 9 or 10mm deep. I know this isn't my best illustration, but the point I'm trying to make is we really don't have enough material left on here to cut a 9 or 10mm deep groove. But luckily, I was able to find this thing on Rockler's website, and this is called a sliding door slide pin. And I think only Rockler carries this. I couldn't find it anywhere else. But basically, these are attached to the back of the door with screws, and we'll have 2 along the bottom and then 2 along the top. And since these holes are slotted like this, we can move these clips out of the way. That way we can move the door, let's go to the right view, straight in and out of the cabinet like this. So once the door is placed straight into the cabinet, we can then drop the clip back into the groove like that, and that's it. So this means that we can keep both the top and bottom grooves at 3mm deep. And another plus is that these clips are only 1.4mm thick, which is actually less than 1/16 of an inch. In fact, we could probably cut it using one of these 1/16 inch bits over at the router table, but I don't recommend it. It's probably gonna break. Now these guys work great on the CNC because we can control the feed rate, but if you're trying to hand route it, forget about it. I also think a 1/8 inch bit is probably too wide for this. So luckily, Tools Today sent me one of their Amana thin curve blades, which has a curve of only 2.3mm, which I think that's gonna be perfect. It's gonna be loose enough for our doors to slide freely and tight enough where it's not gonna go whatever that's called. But anyway, I know I talked a lot, guys. Let's go ahead and get these grooves cut, and then we're gonna finish by cutting 45-degree miters on the ends to match our case and get these glued in. Our first trim piece is glued up, and now we're gonna use this guy as reference to figure out the total length for our second piece. We'll get that cut to length and then glue it on there and just repeat the same process all around the case until all 4 pieces are glued up. Our hardwood trim is slightly thicker than the plywood panels, so when I glue these up, I made sure to stay flush along the inside surfaces. That way we can either sand or use a hand plane to flush things up on the outside surfaces, which is a lot easier to do than if we're trying to do the same on the inside of the cabinet. So far, so good. Right now I got some of these panels wedged in here to remove any sagging from the top. This way we can take the correct measurement between our dados to figure out how tall our partitions need to be, which we are gonna cut using more of this 3/4 inch plywood. And we're also gonna cut some hardwood strips from our offcuts that we're gonna glue along the front edges of our partitions to hide these plywood edges before we get everything glued into our case. And while this space is still open, we're gonna drill some shelf pin holes using this jig here for some floating shelves that we're gonna add later on. We've got all of the important stuff on here. Now all we're missing is a back panel. I just realized that I only have 2 small sheets of 1/4 inch plywood, so I'm not going to be able to make a single back panel that spans the entire length of the case. Instead, I'm going to cut these to 2 equally sized pieces so that the seam where the 2 sheets join will be hidden by our center partition. Alright, before we get these attached on here permanently, we're gonna need to add some cutouts for the wires to come out in the back since this is a media console. But instead of just drilling big holes on here, we're gonna make a custom cutout with a custom cap so that we're not gonna see the wall behind the cabinet when we're sitting on the couch. And to do all of that, we're gonna design it in Shaper 3D and then get those cut out on the CNC. And you guys know how much I love designing in Shaper 3D because I get to do that on my iPad right here in the shop with the project right in front of me where I get to take the measurements I need and immediately start designing without having to run back and forth between the shop and the office. It just saves me so much time. And yes, the program is available on Windows and Mac as well. And what's cool is that it automatically syncs my projects across all of my devices so that I can continue designing on the computer later if I need to. And to further improve my productivity and streamlining my workflow, Shaper 3D has this adaptive user interface that automatically adjusts the menu to put whatever tools I need in that moment right on the screen so that I don't have to waste time scrolling through those default menus. I know it doesn't sound like much, but the amount of time that it saves, it really adds up in the end. And oh, speaking of streamlining, Shaper 3D allows exporting these designs to other industry standard formats like IGES, STEP, or STL, and a bunch of other ones, which means that we can export our designs to programs like SolidWorks or Fusion 360 without having to use any conversion softwares, and then we can continue designing in those programs. Now for this project, we're gonna export it over to Fusion 360 so that we can set things up and get these guys cut out on the CNC. So it goes without saying, Shaper 3D really has improved my productivity here in the shop just by streamlining my entire workflow and allowing me to focus on designing and creating without interruptions. So if you guys want to check out Shaper 3D, go to the link in the descriptions to download the program and start your 14-day free trial. And later, if you do decide that this is something that you want to invest in, you know I got you guys. Use my code BevelishCreations10 to get 10% off your annual pro subscription. So be sure to click on the link in the descriptions to download the app and use the code BevelishCreations10 to get 10% off. Thanks again, Shaper 3D, for sponsoring today's video. And yeah, let's get these guys cut. our case is done. Now let's move this out of the way so we can start making our doors out of this pile of ash. And this is probably the part that's gonna make or break this project because I have honestly never made doors like this, but yeah, let's see how it goes. So we're gonna start by cross-cutting these down to their rough length and make sure to leave everything a little longer than what's called out in the plans if you're following along. I'd say 20 millimeters or 3/4 of an inch or so would probably be a good idea. These ash boards have been sitting in my shop for a while, so there's a little bit of bowing. So we're gonna run them through the jointer to flatten one surface and square up one of the edges before taking it all over to the planer to flatten the opposite surface and bring everything down to their final thicknesses. And then we're gonna go back to the table saw to rip them all to their final width. And here we are, 48 slats and 4 rails to hold it all together. Now for assembly, we're gonna cut evenly spaced dados into our rails for these slats to sit into. I've already got the dado blade set up at the table saw, and I took some test cuts to make sure that we've got a good fit. And to make these guys evenly spaced on here, the method is pretty similar to making box joints. So by design, the gap between the slats is 10.26 millimeters, and we're just gonna round that off to 10.3. So we're gonna use a caliper and set that to 10.3. And lock that off, and then use that to make a mark 10.3 millimeters away from the tip of our blade. And then transfer the mark down to the actual table because the insert has a lot of play in it, so we don't want to use that as our reference. Now we're going to take this little piece of scrap and attach it to our tabletop with double-sided tape and make sure to line up the left edge with the mark that we made earlier. All right, now let's set up the stop on the miter gauge to take our first cut, which is gonna be a rabbet. But we're gonna leave a little bit of material on the end so that we can come back later to flush things up after we've glued in the slats. And once we made the same cut in all 4 parts, we're gonna slide the workpiece over to our little pin, readjust the stop block, and start making our second cut. And once we've done that for all 4 pieces, we're gonna repeat those steps again of setting the scrap into the dado that we just cut, readjust the stop block, and start making our third cut. And once again, make sure to do this for all 4 pieces before moving on. And just keep repeating these steps until all the dados have been cut. So because we're making so many cuts, small errors will compound over the length of this rail, but that's not really a problem because like I said earlier, we left these longer than what was called out for in the drawing, so that after everything's glued up, we can come back and cut off whatever extra material that's left hanging on the ends. So the more important thing is to make sure that the position of the dados all match up. And look at that, the spacing is almost exactly 10.3, which honestly, I could not describe how happy I am to not have screwed that up. Anyway, we're gonna start working on slats now, which we already cut to their final length, so that's equal to the total height of the case. Now, before we start gluing these up, there's still a couple more things we need to do. The first is to cut notches on both ends for the rails to sit into so that this back surface is flush. And then we're gonna finish up by cutting these bevels on the ends. So for the notch, the amount to remove in this direction is pretty straightforward. It's just equal to the thickness here where we cut the dados, but the amount that we need to remove in this direction is what's going to set the height of our door that sits inside the cabinet. And by design, I left 3 millimeter gaps between the door and the case on both the bottom and on top. So what we're going to do is put 3 millimeter thick spacers between the rails and the case and clamp them together. And then we're going to take one of these slats and make sure it's flush up against the case on both the top and bottom surfaces and mark where it meets up with the rail. And then we're gonna line up the dado blade to those layout lines, lock down the stop on the miter gauge, and take our first pass. And then without changing anything, we're gonna rotate the workpiece 180 degrees, bump it up to the stop block, and take a cut on the opposite end. Doing it this way will make sure that both of our cuts are symmetrical to one another. And then we're gonna take off the stop block and take a few more passes to clear out the remaining material. And if we did this right, the slats should have a nice snug fit to the rails, and the back surfaces should all be flush. And once everything looks good, we're gonna repeat the same thing for all the other 47 parts. was a lot of cutting. But hey, we are almost done. All that's left now is to cut the bevels on the ends here. And we are gonna use our tending jig to help with that by holding these pieces up vertically like this. And we're gonna cut 4 or 5 at once because I don't wanna cut any more of these. But yeah, once that's done, we're gonna sand everything and then assemble the doors and cut those doors to their final width. Take a look how cool these doors are in black. I made a completely separate video on my entire process for staining and finishing these. So if you're interested to see that, be sure to check that out. It was just too much information to cover in one video. I also went ahead and painted the clips black as well before getting those attached onto the doors so that they don't end up sticking out like a sore thumb. And once they're screwed in, we're gonna put the doors into the opening, drop the clips into the grooves, tighten, and that is a success. This was definitely the part of the build that worried me the most, and I am so glad that it's over. Now we're gonna start building our drawers using the rest of our 1/2" white ash with some 1/4" plywood for the bottoms. And then we're gonna stain and finish these guys black, just like we did for the doors. And of course, we don't want anything to cover up that beautiful finish, so we're gonna mount everything using these Blum Undermount Drawer Slides. And in case you guys missed it, I did make a separate video going into detail on how to properly size and build the boxes to work with these type of slides. And I'm gonna throw up a link right here if you wanna catch up on that, but otherwise, let's get these guys built. Now that these are in, it's time to install our drawer fronts, which I already cut the sides using some walnut hardwood. And I actually had a plan to cut an integrated finger pull along the top edge so that when this is installed, nothing is gonna stick out and block the door from sliding all the way to the end. But for these to work, we need at least 25 millimeters or about an inch for the fingers to get into, which actually kind of looks weird because of how short our drawer fronts already are. Since I don't like how drawers open when the finger pulls are on the side, we are back to this type of a drawer pull. And just like I've done in the past, we're gonna use the router table to cut a notch along the top edge so that the hardware can sit flush to that surface. When that's all done, we should have something like this, where the drawer pull is flush along the top surface of our drawer front. And oh, by the way, I already sanded these and finished them with a layer of oil before getting the hardware attached using a couple of screws. And now all that's left is to get these guys installed. So to get these properly aligned, we're going to apply double-sided tape to the front of the drawer box and then use some offcuts as shims to help set the gaps that we need for our drawer fronts before sticking them on there. And then just hold it in place until the glue sets, and then we should be able to pull the drawer out and properly secure everything in place using some screws. And that's that. Okay, so if you guys are building this right now and following along with the plans, the dimensions I gave in there should provide enough clearance for this door to slide all the way to the end. But we're all human, right? We make mistakes. So if for some reason the door is hitting this drawer pull, what we can do is add a shim between the drawer pull and the back face of this drawer front. And that's gonna move this drawer pull back to help us get more clearance to this door. I know that took a really long time, but hey, we're finally done with the cabinet portion of the build. And now we're ready to move on to building the base out of this very large piece of 8/4 walnut that we're gonna start cross-cutting into sections for our stretchers and legs, and then we're gonna run the pieces through the jointer and planer to clean up the surfaces. We'll square up one of the edges and then bring all the parts down to their final thicknesses. And then we'll go over to the table saw to rip all the parts to their final width. And for now, we're gonna leave all the stretcher pieces longer than they need to be so that later we can cut them down to their final length after we do a dry fit. All right, we've got everything we need for our base right here. Now let's set aside the stretchers and talk about these legs. So I already cut these to their final dimensions, and now we're gonna add tapers on 2 of these sides. And we're gonna do that right here at the table saw using this monster of a tapering jig. And we are gonna start by laying out our tapers. And of course, we only need to lay out one of these since the one on the second face is gonna be exactly the same. And now we're gonna take this line we just made and use it to line up the blade and set up the angle on the tapering jig. And once it looks good, we're gonna take our first cut. Now we're going to take this little piece of offcut along with a shim that's roughly 3.5 millimeters or about 1/8 of an inch thick. We're gonna stack them together and then tape them back onto the workpiece so that when we lay it down, it should sit flat on the table. And then we're gonna set it back into the tapering jig to make our second cut. And this is what our final piece looks like. Yeah, there's a little bit burning, but nothing a little bit of sanding can't fix. And now we just gotta repeat the same thing for our other pieces. Afterwards, we're gonna do a dry fit to figure out how long to cut these stretchers. And I guess for assembly, we're just gonna use glue and dominoes since that is probably the quickest and easiest way to finish this guy up. And with these legs all clamped up, we are pretty much done. One last thing I want to do is use this rabbiting bit in my router to cut a small groove around the top outer perimeter of the leg assembly so that we create some separation between the top and the base. And once those are cut along all four sides, we're going to use a Forstner bit to cut recesses along the top surfaces of the entire leg assembly for some figure 8 clips to sit into. And this is how we're going to attach the cabinet onto our legs. And lastly, we'll sand everything, apply our finish, and finally get the legs attached to the base for the very first time and bring everything inside the house and start setting things up. And that is the end of the build. What do you guys think? What is your favorite part of this entire thing? Mine would have to be these doors, and not just the doors themselves because I obviously love the way they look, but also just the fact that I can slide these doors from one end to the other, meaning that I can change the aesthetics of this entire piece just by changing where the doors are. And also, what do you guys think about the black on walnut? Because I am currently obsessed with this look. Anyway, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this build, so let me know in the comments. And thank you guys so much for watching, and thanks so much to Shaper 3D for sponsoring this project. And if you guys want to check out Shaper 3D, be sure to use the link in the descriptions to get 14 days free. And if you love the program, be sure to use my code BevelishCreations10 to get 10% off your annual pro subscription. And once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.